Warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. It's a pleasure for us to have you with us. We have more than 200 that signed up for this very important and timely webinar. So once again, thank you and a very warm welcome. I would like to say that this is part of a series, a webinar on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction that we actually started and kicked off in June. And which is about building ambition for the new high seas treaties. So this is the fourth of the series. And what has happened since last then is that there is now currently an ongoing opening of the UN BBNJ intersessional work. So it's an online forum. And for those of you who have followed it, it was actually on environmental impact assessment, which is very timely because that is actually the topic of today's webinar. We're looking into integrating climate change into environmental impact assessment. So my name is Mina Ebbs and I work for IUCN's Global Marine and Polar Program. So this is a webinar that we put together jointly, together with IUCN's World Commission on International Environmental Law. So today, today's meeting will actually be recorded. And we will have a moderator, Simi Payne, who is the chair for IUCN's Commission on World International Environmental Law. And we will also be joined by 3 distinguished speakers that will share their experience as well and give a short presentation. We will also invite our High Seas advisor, Christina Gjerde, to give some remark. You will be able to ask questions. You can drop them in the question panel in this chat, and then we will be able to address them after the presentation when we open up for questions. So we look forward to your active participation, and also like to thank everyone once again who is joining us today, and also to DOSI, which is the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, so also part of organizing this together with IUCN and its commission. So without further delay, I'd like to hand over, but before doing so, also like to extend our gratitude towards the government of Sweden, which are sponsoring this series of webinar. We will come back in the end and conclude and give you a schedule for the next webinar. We are also intending to build a knowledge series on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction in conjunction or in parallel to as the informal discussions are going on and leading up to the IGC4. So once again, thank you very much. And I will hand over to Simi Payne. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mina. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. Good morning, good evening, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. We have seen that increasing scientific understanding of the physical and biological ocean tells us that ocean health is essential to human health and survival, and that it is beautiful, dynamic, and connected. After many years of work leading up to the negotiation, in 2017, the UN General Assembly authorized 4 meetings to negotiate a new legally binding agreement for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, the BBNJ Agreement. I know many of you are deeply familiar with this and even may have negotiated this already, but for those who are just joining, there's a little background. After 3 meetings of the negotiators, a text had been developed, but many questions remained unresolved and still remain unresolved. The 4th meeting, scheduled for this past March, having been postponed, Ambassador Rina Lee initiated the novel intersessional process that Mina referred to, and the first round of these online chat-style exchanges has just finished, having engaged with 4 environmental impact assessment issues. Today, our experts offer you their knowledge of how climate change affects the ocean, why it is critical that climate change be considered in all aspects of the BBNJ Treaty, and how that can be done within the EIA process. A hallmark of climate change is uncertainty. The effects of climate change on Earth's physical and biological systems are occurring with greater rapidity than anticipated. The BBNJ Agreement that we put in place now will govern rights, duties, and cooperation between states in the ocean long into the future. That's why we want to future-proof it, to ensure that the new agreement is fit for purpose 50 years from now and longer. Lisa Levin will take us into the ocean with her current research on the effects of climate change on the ocean. Then Meinhard Doel will explain how environmental impact assessment can be used to integrate information about cumulative effects and the effects of climate change in particular into project planning and approval, leading to recommendations for the BBNJ text. Glenn Wright will present a case study of the Mesopelagic zone. Christina Gerda will join us for the Q&A session at the end, and you're welcome to type your questions at any time into the questions box. So please use it freely. Dr. Lisa Levin, I'd like to now introduce, is the Distinguished Professor of Biological Oceanography and Marine Ecology at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, University of California, San Diego. She co-founded the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI, a group that seeks to integrate science, technology, policy, law, and economics to advise on the management of resource use in the deep ocean in order to maintain the integrity of deep ocean systems, ecosystems. She also co-leads the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, DOOS, which outlines the requirements for future deep ocean observations. Dr. Levin is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Geophysical Union, and received the Prince Albert I Grand Medal for Science for her work linking deep ocean science and policy. Particularly relevant today, she studies ecosystems subject to oxygen and sulfide stress, ocean acidification, and ocean deoxygenation resulting from climate change, and contributes her knowledge to IPCC reports and at the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm hoping my slides, oh, there they are. Good day, everybody. It's my pleasure to be able to talk to you about the relevance of climate impacts on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction and how they are relevant to environmental impact assessment. We know that areas beyond national jurisdiction host a wealth of biodiversity. This takes the form of tuna, whales, fish, jellies in the water, and a vast array of fascinating ecosystems on the seafloor, seamounts, canyons, chemosynthetic ecosystems, and biogenic habitats. We also know that these systems are associated with resources of growing commercial interest, minerals, I'm sorry, go back, please, minerals, fish, and energy and genetic resources. Okay, next, please. At the same time, we have humans emitting massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that are warming the planet. And although much of these emissions, as you can see, occurs in the northern hemisphere, this affects the entire planet and the entire ocean. Next, please. About 93% of the excess heat generated by this carbon dioxide is taken up by the ocean. So our ocean is a tremendous climate mitigator. This heat leads to reduced oxygen solubility and increased stratification, that is a reduced vertical mixing of the seafloor, and that leads to oxygen loss, what we call ocean deoxygenation, and it also leads to reduced export of primary productivity from the surface to the deep sea, through the water. And so there's less food for organisms in deep water. Next, please. We know that the ocean takes up massive amounts of carbon dioxide, about a quarter of the excess carbon dioxide, and this leads to a phenomenon we call ocean acidification. Now, all these changes are happening at the ocean surface, but they don't stay at the surface. Thermohaline circulation transports that more acidic, less oxygenated, warmer surface water to great depths, and so the deep ocean is changing. These changes, warming, acidification, and deoxygenation, are causing redistribution of species, compression of habitats, changes in food webs, loss of biodiversity, and potentially dissolution of our deep water corals. These changes, these climate-induced changes, will interact with human disturbance in many different ways. Next, please. We know that there are massive changes occurring or projected to occur on the sea floor. For example, a reduction in food supply, POC flux, leads to less food on the seafloor and potentially slower recovery of animals from disturbances like seabed mining or bottom fishing. We know that massive areas of the open ocean are subject to declines in pH, and that decline leads to, which is associated with lower aragonite saturation, can dissolve non-living cold water corals and actually slow the recovery time of corals from disturbance. Large areas of the deep ocean experience declining oxygen, and this leads to, next please, it leads to loss of biodiversity and loss of foundation species and exacerbated biogeochemical stress. And we know that a warming temperatures over much of the ocean leads to rising metabolic rates and the redistribution of species and of different kinds of biogenic habitats. So why might we consider climate change and development of environmental impact assessments in ABNJ? Well, I would argue this is necessary to ensure effective protection of the marine environment. Climate change creates shifting baselines with changes in species abundance, distributions, diversity, functions, and spatial heterogeneity. We need to understand climate change to differentiate climate impacts from direct human impacts to enable adaptive management in a dynamic environment, to create resilient spatial and non-spatial management, and to understand cumulative climate impacts. We have a host of different modeling tools that can aid us in doing this. We have climate projections into the future that can tell us which areas will exceed natural variability and when. We can look at cumulative climate hazards in combination with models that project changes in connectivity and changes in habitat suitability. And together, these models can tell us what to protect, which taxa are most exposed to climate change, where to avoid impact, and how climate might act as an added stressor. So to build climate into environmental impact assessments, we need to incorporate it into our baseline studies and monitoring. We need to consider climate in developing triggers and thresholds for carrying out EIAs. We need to consider climate as a cumulative effect, and we need to understand how climate impacts ecosystem services. And so what kinds of actions can we take to mainstream climate change? We need to recognize that natural climate variability and ongoing change are happening and part of the ocean in areas beyond national jurisdiction. We need to develop protected areas and monitoring plans that can delineate resource extraction impacts from climate impacts. We need to ensure effective protection of the marine environment by considering the synergistic effects of direct disturbance. And then finally, it's very important that we make climate relevant data open access and enable their use for ground truth and climate models and other kinds of models in regions targeted for disturbance. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a wonderful presentation. You've made it clear that the ocean's health is essential to climate change mitigation and that it's vulnerable to climate change stress in multiple ways, but that we can provide some protection for ocean systems if we carefully manage our human activities that affect it. And a number of the points you've made about the science are going to be quite relevant both to the intersessional discussions just finished and the ones coming up in the next couple of months. So I'd like now to introduce Meinhard Doelle. Professor Meinhard Doelle is the Canadian Chair and Head of Ocean Sustainability, Governance and Management at World Maritime University. He's also a professor at the School of Law at Dalhousie University. He's advised governments in Canada on environmental assessment, contributing to drafting environmental assessment laws at federal and provincial levels. He's overseen several project and strategic EIA processes and writes extensively on both climate change and environmental assessment. Meinhard, please tell us how we actually go about learning lessons for the EIA sections of the BBNJ Agreement. Thanks.
Thank you, Sydney. So time is short, so let me give you 3 key messages up front in case I run out of time in the end. So my first key message is that the consideration of climate change is critical for effective environmental impact assessment. We cannot afford to ignore this critical issue in the EIA process, and I think this was very well illustrated by Professor Levin's presentation. The second point is that it is important to recognize that there's growing experience with the integration of climate change into EIA in many domestic EIA processes, and also a growing academic literature to draw on. So the BBNJ regime has experience and ideas that it can draw on. The third one is that the key climate issues to include in an EIA there are 4 of them. The first is greenhouse gas emissions associated with a given project. The second are project impacts on climate sinks and reservoirs. The third is the interaction between project impacts and climate impacts on ecosystems and their resilience. And the fourth is the impact of climate change on a proposed project. So in the time that I have, let me just briefly touch on a number of the issues associated with this in light of the 6 elements of environmental impact assessment that are on the slide that you have in front of you. So I'll start with triggering, because triggering is of course a key part of the assessment process. So with respect to integrating climate change into EIA, the key issue here is to what extent should climate consideration affect whether a project gets assessed? And there are 3 basic climate triggers that have been utilized and that should be considered. One is essentially a greenhouse gas emission trigger. So that's either annual project emissions, project life cycle emissions, or a combination of those. So thresholds associated with the emissions of the project. The second is to what extent the proposed project poses a risk to ocean sinks and reservoirs. And the third would be what I call a type of activity trigger. So where you trigger a project just because of the type of project it is associated with significant risks, such as oil and gas development, for example. And most domestic processes that have considered climate change as a trigger have worked with a combination of these approaches. So the second issue then is scope, the scope and the climate consideration of climate change. And there are really 3 scoping issues to consider. The one is, what is the scope of greenhouse gas emissions to consider in the assessment? And many jurisdictions have played around with this idea of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, where scope 1 emissions are emissions that are directly associated with the project. Scope 2 emissions are emissions embedded in energy and other material used for the project, and scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that are enabled by a project, such as upstream or downstream emissions. And then you have to consider the scope of impacts on ocean sinks and reservoirs, and the scope of the interaction between project impacts and climate impacts on affected ecosystems. And my final point on scope and information gathering is that it's important to recognize, and there's a growing recognition in the EA literature certainly, that all impacts are cumulative. So when we talk about this challenge of doing cumulative impact assessment, we have to recognize that all project impacts, all impacts of human activities are cumulative. And so then we move to analysis and review. We start with the gross emissions of the project. We then consider what are the net emissions. So to what extent do the emissions from a project displace or reduce emissions elsewhere? What do the emissions tell us about the project's effect on efforts to decarbonize? Does it help those efforts? Does it hurt those efforts? What effect does the project have on the resilience and effectiveness of ocean sinks and reservoirs, which is critical, of course, in the high seas? And what do we know about the risks and uncertainties of the predictions that are being made about these impacts? And one of the key messages there that many jurisdictions are now realizing and coming to deal with is the need to work with different scenarios. And a simple example of that is different scenarios about the level of mitigation and the associated climate impacts that results from different levels of mitigation efforts globally. We then get to decision making, where we then consider the project's impact on decarbonization effort, consider whether the project supports or undermines the resilience, viability, and effectiveness of ocean sinks, and recognizes that decisions are being made in the face of risks and uncertainties. And then often forgotten is the post-decision phase, where we track compliance with terms and conditions, where we track accuracy of predictions about greenhouse gas emissions, accuracy of predictions about impacts on sinks and reservoirs, and so on. And we do that both to learn for future assessments, but also to make adjustments to the terms and conditions under which projects are approved. And that leaves me with my final point, and that is the role of strategic assessments. And I include in the concept of strategic assessment regional assessments. And I just want to make the point that some of the challenges that are associated with cumulative effects generally and dealing with climate change environmental impact assessment in particular are difficult to resolve at a project level alone. So doing strategic and regional assessments in particular are critical to enhancing climate triggers and dealing with cumulative effects analysis at the project. And of course, both regional and strategic assessments are particularly important for high risk activities such as geoengineering, extractive sectors, new sectors that have come along, and for preventing loss of productivity of climate sinks and reservoirs. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meinhard. I think that you have laid out a clear path based on experience for how to integrate climate change into different aspects of project assessment. And that I think will be very reassuring as we go forward and think about how to do this as an international community. I would also like to remind the audience that in the poster, you'll see links to some of Meinhard's writing and to Lisa's Ravel talk that you might find interesting if you haven't been taking close notes yourself. So our next speaker will be Glenn Wright. Glenn Wright is a senior researcher at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, IDRI, based in Paris. At IDRI, he has authored many exceptionally useful publications on marine policy and ocean governance. My personal favorite is The Long and Winding Road to BBNJ, a must-read to understand the negotiation. He also runs Little Blue Letter, an uplifting ocean newsletter curated each week by a young leader in marine science and policy. So Glenn, would you join us and tell us a bit more about the Mesopelagic zone? So the Mesopelagic zone is a part of the ocean that is only recently been studied, and it is an area, therefore, of particular interest and concern as we develop regulatory tools, governance tools. And so it'll be really wonderful to have Glenn take us into that zone and help us understand how EIA and climate change can be addressed there. Thank you.
I'm hoping that you're now able to see my slides. Someone could confirm.
We can
Fantastic.
see that.
Wonderful. A brief moment of panic there when the settings dialog box popped up and told me I wasn't allowed to show you my slides, and I would be somewhat lost without them. This is a subject actually that is relatively new to me and to the work that we do at IDRI, and so it's quite exciting for me to be able to give this presentation in the context of the high seas negotiations. And what I'll try to do in this presentation is I don't have time to go into a huge detail on the Mesopelagic zone, possible future development of fisheries and the regulatory framework, but I would like to give some idea and some concrete example about how a new agreement could affect impact assessment using this as a case study. So if you haven't had the pleasure of seeing some of these sorts of images before from the Mesopelagic zone, it's a vast ocean realm that very little light reaches. It's approximately 150 to 1,500 meters of depth. And it's dominated largely by the kinds of organisms you see at the top, cephalopods, siphonophores, but there are also huge quantities of fish. You see in the middle here examples of different species of lanternfish. And then, of course, interesting plankton and other creatures. It's a highly connected ecosystem, and these are the aspects that we're just starting to learn more about in terms of marine science. I'm hoping the animation that you see on the screen works, but what this shows is the huge migration that happens overnight every day for lanternfish and other organisms that come up from the bottom. As the sun goes down, they're less liable to be eaten by predators, so they come up to the surface to feed. And in doing so, what they do is bring a huge amount of minerals and nutrients from the bottom up to the surface and vice versa. And they also, in doing so, play a huge part in the global carbon cycle. So essentially everything that sort of begins at the top layer of the ocean passes through the Mesopelagic zone, eventually on its way down to the bottom of the ocean, where eventually things get stored as carbon. So this is a very busy diagram, but just essentially showing those different aspects, so how these different zones are connected, and in particular how the Mesopelagic zone connects things like primary producers like plankton to higher level predators like tuna, for example. So that's a very brief introduction. In terms of our scientific knowledge, it's sort of widely agreed that this zone is one of the most poorly understood, whether that be from the ecology or biochemistry or the interlinkages between different ecosystems. We're still very limited on the kinds of data that we would usually use to manage human activities. So the role that the zone plays in the carbon cycle, as I mentioned, connectivity with other areas, and particularly when it comes to fish species population data that we would normally use for stock assessments and modeling. We just don't have that kind of information yet. But there is a huge amount of scientific research ongoing. Woods Hole, whose photos I've used extensively here, have an excellent Ocean Twilight Zone project, which is looking at these ecosystems. There's JETSON, which is a collaboration between various organizations. And the EU is also currently funding a couple of large-scale projects that are looking to improve the science base, improve scientific knowledge, but also starting to look at possible exploitation of this zone for fisheries resources, which I will come on to shortly. So just sort of summary of the critical points. I mean, I would emphasize the limited scientific understanding. It really is developing. We still have a lot to learn about this zone, and particularly the connectivity. It plays a really important role in food webs, like I said, connecting primary producers like plankton to higher level, like apex predators like tuna. And it also plays a really important role in the global carbon cycle. So that's just to stress the sort of importance. In terms of fisheries development, we've known about the possibility of this being an exploitable fishery source since about the 1960s, but for various technical reasons and also that the fish aren't very palatable, there hasn't been a development of large-scale commercial fisheries to date. But there is now growing interest in exploiting these fisheries. And particularly for use in what we call nutraceuticals, like omega-3 oils, and possibly also to use in fish feed for aquaculture. And at the moment, we see in the literature and sort of amongst science and kind of policy fields, this sort of growing tension between the interest in exploiting the fisheries on the one hand, but a growing concern amongst the scientific community that stresses the lack of scientific knowledge. In terms of the governance framework, and this is where the impact assessment becomes relevant, I can't go into a huge amount of detail here, but on the left here, you see there's a range of existing international instruments that apply to fisheries in various guises, and in some sense apply or are likely to apply according to our sort of analysis of the framework to mesopelagic fisheries. At the very least, the Law of the Sea Convention and Fish Stocks Agreement appear to require states to cooperate to manage the mesopelagic fish stocks, usually through a regional fisheries management organization, an RFMO. But in any case, they would have to apply the principles of the Fish Stocks Agreement, so the precautionary principle, conservation, sustainable use, cooperation, and clearly to have some sort of impact assessment if we were to develop a new fishery. Unfortunately, there is no requirement under any of these instruments to conduct some comprehensive environmental assessment. So that would include the impacts of the fishery on climate or on other aspects of the ecosystem. So for lanternfish, this type of mesopelagic fish that may be used for eventually for human consumption, for example, we wouldn't necessarily need an impact assessment on what that would cause for the predators that feed on them.
Glenn, you have 1 minute.
Thanks. In terms of the institutional framework, I mean, RFMOs have had a very mixed performance and often been very slow to address biodiversity impacts, and they don't tend to include states that have an interest in biodiversity. So in this regard, the BBNJ Agreement could strengthen the existing provisions, but it's not yet clear to what extent this will have sort of a new global process versus leaving it to the existing sectoral bodies like RFMOs. I won't go, obviously, in the 30 seconds that are left into this, but I will leave this in the slides. It's just a comparison of some of the established good practice in impact assessment that Meinhard has already mentioned. So, for example, having triggers based on clear criteria, and particularly for poorly understood ecosystems or vulnerable ecosystems, having more sensitive triggers, and comparing this to the current practice under fisheries management organizations, which are very much focused, understandably, on the potential for fisheries, on the impact on stocks. But if I could take one thing from this table, the most important, I would say, is the lack of mechanism for consultation of non-fishing states within RFMOs. And so currently, if you want to have an impact assessment for a proposed mesopelagic fishery, it would be limited to an RFMO process, which is quite focused on sector-specific provisions. In terms of integrating climate, of course, a single sector impact assessment will not account for cumulative impacts, won't account for climate impacts. And so it seems clear that a new international agreement has to set some sort of standard that would either raise the bar for impact assessment done under the current framework, or likely much better would be to provide a more global process where different states and stakeholders can be involved, where climate impacts can be discussed, and hopefully where strategic assessments of the kind Meinhard mentioned could also take place. And so just in concluding, I would say it's critically important, obviously, that climate is included in impact assessments. The current framework, which is focused on fisheries, wouldn't be suitable or effective for such a proposal. The agreement could strengthen this with global standards, ensuring participation. And I think mesopelagic fisheries provide a sort of a case study of a clear example of a new activity where the current framework would not adequately address climate impacts or biodiversity impacts. So we really need a cooperative effort required to understand these ecosystems, to understand their climate links, and to develop effective management mechanisms. And so hopefully that's something that a BBNJ agreement could bring. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. I think your presentation really illustrates how this can work and why it's important. So thank you very much. And I'd like to now invite all the speakers to join us for the discussion by turning on their cameras. And we're also joined by Professor Christina Gerda, who is Senior High Seas Advisor for the International Union for Conservation of Nature Global Marine and Polar Program, and Adjunct Professor at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California. In addition, she's a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law, hooray, the World Commission on Protected Areas, and with Lisa Levin serves as co-lead of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI. She's been a long-time participant in these negotiations on behalf of IUCN, and we thank her for that work. So opening the question and answer. We have a number of questions from the audience, and we'll begin with Roderick Hart from the European Commission asks, Professor Doelle stated that certain climate impacts are difficult to resolve at the project level alone, suggesting that strategic assessments would be better suited to address such impacts. Meinhard, could you elaborate on that, and perhaps with a concrete example? You're muted.
Oh, sorry. So sure, happy to. I think the example Glenn gave is actually a perfect example of this. For us to understand the impact of projects on climate change, we have to understand their impact on the Mesopelagic, because it is such a significant carbon sink and reservoir. So that means that you have to understand all these dynamics. So if you're, for example, if there's a proposal to start to fish the Mesopelagic zone, you have to consider the impact of that. And that's very difficult to do in the context of one particular project. But if you did a strategic environmental assessment of fishing the Mesopelagic, then I think you would have a much better chance of raising some of these issues. Let me just give you one other example, and that is that whenever you're faced with a region where all kinds of different things could happen, it's very difficult to address all those different scenarios at the project level. So you can have different levels of activity, different kinds of activity, but you can also have we also have to create different scenarios for what the mitigation efforts will be like globally and what impact that has on climate impacts in a particular region, because those climate impacts will interact with project impacts to then have impacts on ecosystems. So those are things that are very difficult to do at the project level. But if you set up regional assessments and strategic assessments prior to project level assessments, you can make significant project progress, and you can set the context for doing effective and efficient project level assessments.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you know what we start to see is that this kind of collaboration can also make the projects better and maybe open some options that hadn't been thought of originally by the project proponents, and that doing this in a larger collaboration through an SEA is a longer term kind of planning option. Yeah, Christina, please.
Hi, just in terms of examples, another good example is, of course, deep seabed mining. That's where contractors have been expected to conduct these 15 years of exploration, but only recently have we really discovered the importance of the Mesopelagic in these climate change and food provision services for all of our commercially important fish species. So it's really important to go back and sort of try to think through who needs to be involved in these discussions, how can we better engage these different sectors as well as the biodiversity interests, and look at what the potential impact of deep seabed mining could be on CO2 sequestration. And of course, as Lisa Levin was stressing, what are the added impacts of a new activity like deep seabed mining on an already climate stressed ocean? It may be different in different parts of the ocean, but we need a far better understanding of how these things interact. Thanks.
Other comments on that, or other reflections that you'd like to add on the strategic and environmental assessment? Lisa?
I mean, let me just say that the modeling tools that I talked about are particularly useful in that regard for doing regional assessments to look, because there's so much heterogeneity in how climate change manifests itself. It's not uniform across the ocean, and so even within a single region, you can see areas that will be more and less vulnerable. And so we applying these tools can be very helpful in achieving what everybody else has been talking about.
You know, I had a question. I'll take moderator's prerogative to ask it, which is, I think we see the scientists as being maybe not in an ivory tower, but off on a research vessel, and maybe somewhat inaccessible. So if I'm a policymaker backing capital, looking at this and thinking, well, this is all great, but I don't have scientists on tap who I can call on. Can you offer some thoughts on what can I do?
Well, this is exactly why the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative was created, really. This is a group of, I just learned yesterday, there's more than 1,500 people involved now from 70-some countries, 78 countries, something like that. And 11 working groups, and one of the working groups focuses exclusively on the BBNJ treaty, but there are groups, a climate working group and a fisheries working group and a marine genetic resources working group and a pollution and debris working group and so on. And so these are all scientists who've indicated a willingness to engage in policy, and many of them do now try to work with policy people like those of you on this webinar. And I think, you know, all I would say is if you are in need of access to scientists, contact me or Maria Baker at dosi-project.org. You can, and or our email. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So there are scientists on tap. Excellent. So we have another question. This is for everybody. How should the BBNJ instrument treat with other processes under existing relevant EIA frameworks to prevent a fragmented approach to incorporating climate change considerations? Who'd like to tackle that first? Meinhardt. You're unmuted. You're on mute. Oh, you can't unmute? Oh, no.
Oh, okay, now I am. Sorry, I lost control over my mute. So, so I lost my train of thought now, but what was the question?
So how should the BBNJ instrument interact with other processes?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have learned from environmental impact processes in many jurisdictions that the most efficient, effective, and fair way of doing environmental assessments is to have all decision makers actively involved in one process. So the ideal scenario is that we create a mechanism whereby all decision makers with respect to a particular proposal or activity come together to jointly design and implement one process, and then the environmental impact assessment report informs the various decision makers. So if you have a region where there are decisions to be made by the International Seabed Authority, by regional fisheries management organizations, by the IMO, and maybe by decision makers set up under the new BBNJ regime, all those decision makers would come together and do one assessment. That is the ideal scenario for integrating all the considerations into an environmental impact assessment process.
Any other comments that anyone would like to make on that question?
I'll go after Glenn.
I was going to say I'll go after Christina. I mean, perhaps just to sort of build on that and add something on where the negotiations are and what the current framework looks like. I mean, no really sort of coherent approach seems to emerge at the moment from the draft text. There's sort of two branches almost. One would be more towards a globalized or internationalized process, which I think would be closer to what you're referring to, Meinhard, where you bring these things together and try and reduce that fragmentation. And another strand is more the not undermining approach, which would be to sort of where impact assessment processes already exist for certain sectors or regions under existing instruments. We would leave them alone in some way, or only do a brief review of whether those processes are actually effective. I mean, to bring that to the mesopelagic fisheries example, I mean, there would be a concern there that a regional fisheries management organization could do a very minimalistic review of an exploratory fishery that wouldn't include all the different stakeholders, climate impacts, and all of these other aspects that would effectively be rubber stamped or wouldn't be looked at more closely by the High Seas Agreement, because there's a process in place and they don't want to undermine what's already there. So I see two very different routes that the treaty and that the future of this could go down, and indeed one wouldn't really contribute much to reducing that fragmentation. And maybe just a final thought is just that at the very least, if a new treaty can establish some sort of global minimum standard for things like the scope of impact assessment, what should be included, explicitly stating that climate change and biodiversity impacts must be integrated. If then all of the existing sectoral approaches could incorporate at least those minimum standards, that would go some way to increasing the coherence, I think.
I just say the environmental impact assessment provisions are one place where the BBNJ agreement can truly help to strengthen existing organizations as well as enhance cooperation and collaboration. I would agree on the need for global minimum standards, and by providing these global minimum standards, you're actually able to uplift and strengthen the performance of these regional and sectoral organizations by ensuring they have access to the best available information. You can't talk about deep seabed mining if you're not engaging with the fisheries scientists. There are many aspects of the changing environment that we need to be able to cooperate and engage at a much higher level and a much more frequent level than they're currently doing. So the approach that would create the BBNJ agreement with the EIA provisions as sort of the gold standard, and engage and encourage all players to actually live up to these standards. And as Glenn said, the consultation is actually absolutely vital at all the stages of the game, including at the scoping, where the critical decisions are really being taken about what questions need to be asked in order to create a effective environmental impact assessment. And just as Meinhard was saying, you need to be going up the streams of strategic environmental assessment, what's going on in the region and how are these regions interconnected. I would just like to recommend Meinhard's article with Gunnar Sanders on next generation environmental impact standards and integrating those into the BBNJ agreement. That's been my Bible while working with Glenn on the study, the case study on the Mesopelagic. Thanks.
Great. We're getting towards the end of our time, so I'm going to put 2 questions and invite the panel to respond to those and perhaps offer a final comment. I leave it to you. So the first question, I'm sorry, my knowledge of the French Environmental Code is not what it should be, but from Mère Martin, would it be relevant to get inspiration from Chapter 1, 2, and 3 of the French Code of Environment, especially for the public consultation / investigation that is crucial to the decision-making process regarding a given project? It probably would be well worth looking at it in any case, and if anyone can answer specifically, excellent. And then from Ipshita Chaturvedi, a question about how important is including people and organizations from developing countries to discuss EIA parameters in the oceans. If it is important, then why do we see their representation missing constantly? And I'd like to make a quick comment to that myself, which is that it's one of the things that I find extremely valuable about the UN, which is often derided, but it is a place where we do get to hear voices from developing countries and particularly small island states, which are often have difficulty because of resources having access. And finally, a question, the Antarctic Treaty System has a detailed EIA system. What lessons can be drawn from it? And I will also make a quick note that the High Seas Alliance has a paper about the Madrid Protocol on its website. So if you Google High Seas Alliance resources, you can find a very interesting paper talking about exactly this. So now let me turn it over. Dr. Levin, would you like to start off with your valedictory words and comments on the questions?
Well, all right. I am perhaps the only non-policy person on here. I'm a scientist, but I guess I'll just comment on one of these questions, and that has to do with the engagement of these less developed countries. And I would say that we have not done an adequate job of raising awareness about the importance of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Most people, if they know anything about the ocean, it's what's in their backyard if they live near the coast. And I do think that the incredible importance in terms of biodiversity and climate regulation and more needs to become more common knowledge, not just less developed countries, but landlocked countries as well. I think everybody has a stake in what happens in areas beyond national jurisdiction, but most of the people on this planet don't know that, and they need to. Yeah. And we need to work harder at making that information available.
Meinhardt, would you like to? Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Thank you for your participation.
Yeah, so I'll just make a couple of general comments that I think maybe go part way towards answering some of the questions. And so my general observation and recommendation is that we need to draw on all experience with environmental impact assessment, with how to integrate climate change into environmental impact assessment, with how to engage the public effectively environmental impact assessment. So whether that's the French code or whether that is experience in developing countries or whether that is the Madrid Protocol, we need to draw on all of that. But what we need to avoid is to try to look to one existing system and just copy and paste, because we're trying to develop an environmental impact assessment process that will stand the test of time and that is ready for the huge challenges that the high seas are facing. And we cannot do that by simply basing this process on past experience. And that is frankly the biggest concern I have. And the reason Gunnar and I wrote the piece that we did is because we feel that we need new perspectives on how to do this effectively. And that means going beyond current practice. And there are many rich ideas about how to do things better going forward. And I think we need to draw on those lessons if we're going to set up an effective process.
Thank you. That's great. Glenn?
I really don't have much to add to that. I mean, I would stress very much the same. I mean, my concern is that in the negotiations, we are still focused very much on a kind of procedural and technical EIA process and missing that bigger picture sort of assessments and sort of regional and strategic assessments and actually bringing a coherent process that is focused on biodiversity, climate, and the ecosystems rather than on specific processes for projects and for sectors. And I mean, I think impact assessment has come a very long way in the last few decades, and the treaty really ought to reflect that. And I think you're absolutely right, Meinhard. I mean, if you can draw from different examples that we already have, great. But actually, the high seas is its own, specific context, and it has its own challenges. And so, if anything, we actually need to modernize and sort of make bespoke processes even more clearly for the high seas. So, yeah, would stress that also.
Thank you. And Christina, a brief word.
Okay, well, having been involved in the discussions on deep sea bottom fishing, I would just stress the importance of now we have an opportunity to include at least a substantive objective, substantive direction, not to be causing significant adverse impacts. That was with the deep sea bottom fishing, it took the United Nations General Assembly to adopt a resolution to say we need to be conducting environmental impact assessments and we need to be adopting managing practices to ensure we avoid significant adverse impacts. And this, in many ways, revolutionized fisheries management for the non-tuna RFMOs, but we still lack those procedural safeguards that we get from the Convention on Biological Diversity or from best practice and hopefully the BBNJ. So we need a marriage of best practice from within, beyond national jurisdiction to create a new agreement that truly is fit for purpose for the next 20, 30, and hopefully 50 years. So thank you.
Thank you all. And I'd now like to turn the floor over to Mina Epps. Please, yes, out, Mina.
Thank you very much, Simi, and thank you for excellent speakers, for your very concise and extremely informative presentations. You highlighted the need for baselines, triggers, and thresholds. You shed a light on the Mesopelagic zone, so thank you for that. But also to share your valuable knowledge and lessons learned, and giving us some takeaways for concrete actions to mainstream climate change integration into environmental impact assessment and ultimately into a new legally binding agreement. We need an ambitious agreement, and the treaty needs to be future-proof, what we just heard. And with that, I would also like to end that we will actually be hosting another webinar on the 22nd of October, which is about continuing building ambitions for the High Seas Treaty, but building on ecological and institutional resilience in areas beyond national jurisdiction via the BBNJ Agreement. And this is based on a newly published paper co-authored by Christina Jaarder herself. So we look forward to joining, for you to join us then as well. So thank you very much for listening in, for your engagement, and let's keep the hope up for an ambitious treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.